Good afternoon, collectors and friends. Welcome back to another edition of Trading Card Therapy, episode number 84. Happy holidays to all my friends that are out there. Hope you're having a wonderful time finishing up the year, and a special happy birthday to my son Crosby, who turns double digits today and is now 10 years old. So today we have a very special guest in store. We're going to bring him on in just a couple of minutes. But first, a few announcements. So the Philly show was just a couple weeks ago. The next one's going to be in March. So if you are in the tri-state area and you've never been, I highly recommend it. There's also lots to do in the area, as the Oaks facility that they hold the convention at is just an earshot of some great restaurants, as well as the King of Prussia Mall. I believe the next show is going to be in March of 2025. For all the details for the upcoming Philly show, go to thephillyshow.com. So speaking of the Philly show, I have been looking for this particular card, I believe since it came out in 1992. And to be clear, I could have bought this card along the way, like an ungraded version. But in recent years, with grading, of course, becoming super important in the hobby, I wanted to try to find a high-grade example. And you wouldn't believe it, but I saw this 1992 Pro-Line portraits of Muhammad Ali, which is literally one of the first ever pack-inserted autographs. And you can see that right here. That's the stamp that Pro-Line used on all of their pack-inserted autographs in the 1992 Pro-Line Portraits edition. This one, of course, is signed by Ali. There's a few versions of this. I think a couple are Cassius Clay. There's even a couple versions where apparently he signed both Cassius Clay and Muhammad Ali. I like this because it's a nice, clean autograph right above his face. And I would prefer it on the front of the card. But this, to me, is such an iconic card. And there's the front. It is the 1992 Pro-Line Portraits Muhammad Ali Team NFL autograph. And as I mentioned, it has the stamp, so you know that it was inserted in packs, because there are a few of these, I guess, autograph, but aftermarket. In other words, they weren't inserted in packs. And as you can see here, the card itself is graded a 9. The autograph is graded a 9. And if you go to PSA's website and verify the pop report, this is only one of two graded with a 9 grade and a 9 auto, and there are no examples higher. So this one's going to be with me for quite some time. I'm curious, have you landed anything this year in your collection that you might call a white whale, or something that you've been looking for a super long time? If so, let me know in the chat below, because I would love to hear about it. The other card that I wanted to mention before we bring on Chris is we recently bought an incredible, albeit small, worldwide gum collection of cards from Canada. And what made this collection super unique is that within a very small collection of worldwide gum cards, there was 1 Lou Gehrig and 2 Babe Ruths. Now, we didn't grade the Babe Ruths yet. We just got back to Lou Gehrig, which I'm going to share with you in a minute. But before I do, for those of you that have not heard the brief background on this collection, I was going to go up to Canada to see this family, as well as do some other business up there. However, this gentleman advised us that it would be difficult for us to come in and see him and find him. And we're like, well, why? He said, and I quote, "The closest traffic light to my home of where I reside in Canada is 500 kilometers away." Well, for those of you that don't know what that is in miles, that's about 300 miles. Can you imagine about a 5-hour drive, and that's the closest traffic light to your home? Needless to say, I think we made a wise decision in letting him ship it into us using our FedEx number. And this is a Lou Gehrig, which I'm not going to show you the grade at first, but this card is a beauty. So at first glance, it looks like it legitimately could be like a 6. However, upon closer look and then getting it back from PSA, it got a 4. Now, I think it's accurately graded for a few reasons. It's got a little bit of surface wear, a little bit of corner wear, but man, back 5 years ago, this would have been a 5 or a 6 with PSA, no doubt. And I'm curious, have some of you out there noticed also that PSA's standards have seemed to evolved over time, and they're just a little bit harder on vintage cards these days than they used to be. Let me know your thoughts in the chat below. All right, and now we are going to bring on Chris. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Leighton, how are you?
Great. So for those that don't know Chris, this is Chris Torres, that I like to call, and Chris, please, this is a compliment, and if you saw the Dos Equis ads, you'll appreciate this. I believe Chris is one of the most interesting men in the collecting hobby. And we're going to get into that today on the show. I really appreciate you joining us, Chris.
No, thank you, Leighton. I appreciate the compliment. That's a heck of a one. So,
yeah,
and by the
absolutely.
way, happy birthday to Crosby. I had no idea it was his birthday. So happy birthday.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, we got to spend, I had him for Christmas this year, as well as his birthday this morning. And I just dropped him off at his mother's. We had such a great holiday time. And, a lot of people complain, if your birthday's around the holidays, you kind of get shorted. And this kid woke up like a pencil today out of bed. He was so happy, certainly didn't feel slighted in the least. And to be fair, he gets to celebrate his birthday with me and now his mother and some of his friends. So I'm really excited for him, and I appreciate that very much, Chris. So Chris, for those that don't know you, maybe the way that I know you, can you share with everyone just a little bit about who you are, kind of your background? We're going to get into hobby stuff in just a minute. But if you could introduce yourself and how people can find you, maybe, on the internet.
Yeah, so from a background perspective, I am originally from West Texas. I grew up playing golf, and I was a Division I college golfer, so that was sort of in my past. And then, in my 20s, I moved to Atlanta, moved up to Chattanooga, Tennessee. And if you were to look at my resume, my professional resume, you would say this guy must be a millionaire. And that's because I spent 15 years with GameStop. When I left just before COVID, right, I didn't own any stock. There's a whole nother story behind that, but I am still in the working world. I left retail about 5 to 6 years ago. I'm now in automotive management, basically on the collision industry side. So that's where I'm at the moment. It's been a wonderful change going from, true-born retail to automotive. But then from a collection perspective, I would say most people, if you got to know me 4 to 5 years ago, you would say I was the Project 2020 individual, Project 70. But then over the past several years, you will know me from my T206 collection, and then what I have done with the set overall from a permanent perspective on my two arms. So,
well, I appreciate you sharing that, Chris. I'm curious, when did your collecting journey start? So, did you start collecting when you were a kid or a little bit older?
Yeah. So the first memory I have of collecting or buying baseball cards was I was about 10 years old. It was 1991 Topps. I remember going to my first ever card show in El Paso, Texas, and then meeting this dealer the next week or the next day. He was a referee at a basketball game, and I purchased the 1991 Topps set. And so I collected all the way through the 90s up until I went to college. And then I got back in around 2006. This is back when Bowman Draft was available in blaster form. And one of my first ever blasters, I pulled an Evan Longoria auto. And for anyone who knows, that was the autograph to hit back then.
Totally.
The Superfractor, though, has never surfaced. I still wonder if that car was ever produced. But then from there, I was really a modern collector from 2006 on. And so I got into football a little bit, but I was always drawn to baseball. And then I got really heavy into player collecting Thomas Howard from the Raiders. And that is because he played football at UTEP when I was there as a golfer. Now, he was a little bit younger than me. I only knew him in passing, but having a connection to a player that I sort of knew in a kind of offhanded way was kind of neat. But that also really set me forward on where I'm at now with my collection. For anyone who's a Raiders fan, they'll know Thomas Howard unfortunately killed himself and an innocent bystander in an accident. And I was left with this massive Thomas Howard collection that I just didn't know what to do with. And I still have a few of the low numbered Bowman Chrome stuff, but all the autographs, anything he touched, which is weird for me to say out loud, I got rid of. And I sent it to Blowout. I think I sent it for like $1 each. I got like $50 or $100 years ago. And that was the moment I really stopped collecting actual living players. I just have somewhat of not buyer's remorse, but I prefer to now collect players who can never create a headline at 2 a.m. on TMZ.
That's a really interesting way to put it, Chris. I think I feel similar. I do dabble in modern.
Mm-hmm.
Admittedly, I have some Luka, I have some Otani, but I'm also a sports fan.
Yep.
So I don't know that I'm buying them because of investment per se, even though, of course, I hope they go up like everyone else with their own assets.
Yeah.
But I have talked about it at length, and I don't usually hear a collector say it the way that you just did, and I really appreciate that. Meaning, Chris, from a dealer side, you can imagine, right? What if I go on vacation with my son for a week? What if I get ill for a few weeks, or whatever the case may be? I really don't want or can afford for my inventory to be so volatile.
Mm-hmm.
So something that I recognized, maybe in the same way that you did, was that, listen, there might be something that comes out about Ty Cobb on an annual basis or Shoeless Joe. But in general, these folks have already made a name for themselves, good or bad.
Yep.
Their stats are permanently in the record books,
Yep.
Once again, good or bad. And it's just a little bit less volatile. Now, it may not be as exciting. In other words, like your guy's not going to have a 50 home run, 50 steal season like Otani. And you're not going to necessarily be the number one search term on Google. That's just not how it works for players that are deceased.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with you wholeheartedly that if you're looking for a little bit more of an even-keeled experience in the hobby, collecting vintage certainly can offer that.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like with the passing of this former Raider, that was a big wake-up call for you as far as your collecting was concerned.
It was very much, and it was an uneasy feeling, like owning those cards. And I remember back in my real heyday of his collection, I owned 30% of the print run of his Ultimate Collection autograph, and these were cards at a 250. And like I had a dream of maybe owning 100 of them, 150, right? That was a great set back in the day for football. It was an expensive set, but he was a linebacker, so it wasn't that expensive to buy his cards on the secondary market. So I was buying a lot for his collection out of expensive boxes. But it just was like, at the end of the day, anything he touched, I had to get rid of. And it took me a while to actually get to that point. I didn't know why at first I didn't know why. Like, I just was like, a collection was a collection. And then it dawned on me, like, I just don't like what happened. I mean, he killed an innocent person in a car accident. Like, that's just not, it's unfortunate it's an accident, but I just couldn't stand to have the collection anymore. So blowout got it.
Well, listen, I commend you for, probably taking a loss and really just going. Yeah. I mean, I didn't want to say it, but you did. Yeah. I suspected that you probably lost your butt on it.
Yeah.
But that aside, Chris, something that doesn't get talked about often enough, and maybe because, it's a little bit uncomfortable, but the feelings that come with our collection are something that really isn't often talked about. And, as I mentioned Kraz a little bit ago, I don't collect what he collects, but yet I'm diving, head first into One Piece and learning all about it and taking what I've learned about collecting and trying to help him kind of build his collection. So I'm curious, how did you go from, I understand why you left the modern, but how did you go from that to literally one of the most iconic sets ever made? Like, was there a stop in between? Did you have a guru or a mentor that said, hey, man, I don't know what you've been doing with the Raiders, but you got to collect T206s. What happened for you, Chris?
Yeah, so it's an interesting sort of transition in how it happened. And so when I was at the 2019 National, this was my very first ever National. Now, I think I went to one back in the late 90s. Maybe it was in Vegas. I remember going to a card show when I was a kid, but from an adult perspective now, as an adult now, this was the first biggest one I'd ever gone to, and it was in Chicago. So at that point, Project 2020 had ended. Project 70 was going on with Topps, and that was what I was doing from a content perspective. From all of my communication and social media was all around Project 2020 and Project 70. But how T206 gets involved here is I wanted something to commemorate my first ever National. And so I went there with the objective of buying one Chicago Cubs card from the T206 set, because I had known about this set as a baseball card collector, as a baseball card fan. It always seemed very intimidating. It always seemed sort of out of reach because you see these huge sales, you see who buys them. And so,
and by the way, for the folks that don't know, it's called the Monster for a reason.
Yeah. exactly the monster. So it was very intimidating. But I wanted just 2 cards, and so I wanted 2 cards to commemorate my set, and that's really where the spark happened. Holding that card raw for the first time was like, it's another feeling where it's like I didn't expect it to be that monumental in my collecting career or my personal life now, but it was just holding that raw card. And I'll tell anyone who collects T206 or anything pre-war, when you first get in, you have to buy these cards raw, because touching something, holding something that right now is 115 years old, it's monumental. It's something that card is going to look way better than me at 115, but I'm just its caretaker, in the moment in time.
Chris, I've had on a number of guests on Trading Card Therapy, and yet that piece of advice you gave is just so poignant and on the money that if you are someone who's considering, forget about investment, you just would like to partake for yourself, with your son, with a cousin, with a friend, and you want to maybe jump into Gaudies or into T206s or anything like pre-warish, 100% agree with you. Having that card in your hand, I wouldn't say it's biblical in terms of an experience, but joking aside, when I was 13 years old, to be fair, it was probably 11, my father found 4 cards in his desk that he still had from his childhood. But keep in mind, they actually weren't cards he collected. He believes he either traded someone or someone in the neighborhood gave them to him. They were 4 cards from the 1934 Gaudi set. Now, keep in mind, Chris, when I was that age, I didn't know what these were. And there was no internet. There was no Google. There was no VCP. There was no Card Ladder. There was no eBay. So I literally, went all over town trying to find out what these were. But I'll tell you, man, I'm getting goosebumps now. Holding those cards, knowing that they were from decades ago, is an incredible feeling. And I agree with you. Even if you don't necessarily continue that journey, it's really cool to hold something that another fellow American held decades ago. And in this case, with the T206s, I wanted to share a quick story. So I visited 2 different sets of friends yesterday on Christmas. And one of them is someone who lives in New Jersey, but he really has he loves Buffalo. He does some business in Buffalo. He's an attorney, and he loves the Bills, and he's actually taking his daughter this weekend to a football game. And so I brought down to his 3 kids this weekend, or yesterday when I saw them for Christmas. I gave him, the kids, each a T206 Buffalo player. Oh. They were ungraded, but when you factor in that they're 115 years old, they can hold it in their hands. These players come from the city that these kids are really interested in. He's taking his daughter to Buffalo because she likes the city of Buffalo. It then is obvious to me that baseball cards are much more than just a little trinket or a little collectible. It's our connection to our people, to our history, and to our past. And it seems like you discovered that for yourself as well, Chris.
Oh, absolutely. These are players that I'm never going to see. I have to physically learn about. Like, I have to go do the research. I am learning facts. One of the players, Del Howard, for example, that we'll talk about here in a second, learning in this journey after about his card that he's buried here in Seattle. Like, that was like, whoa, like, oh my gosh. And then going to his gravesite, right? That's something that you can't explain. And it's not something I ever expected to happen when I started this collecting journey. Yes, I'm watching the modern game, but I want to experience and learn about the past. And this is, to me, the best way to do it through the T206 set.
I think it's awesome, Chris. Now I'm curious, because I have still lots of other questions, but I know in particular, I believe that your T206 journey started with polar bear backs.
That was my first ever Hall of Famer. So amongst the first purchase, so it was Frank Chance, polar bear back from John Goodman at the National, who I visit every year.
I know John, sure.
I see him every year. He sold me Frank Chance, cut to death. It was an A grade. I still have it. It's for $60, and that was the first ever polar bear I purchased. And
so when you purchased that, did you decide then and there that you were going to do the full polar bear run? And if not, how did that all come to be?
No, so it was a sort of not a long journey to get the polar bear, but it was sort of a journey filled with errors as far as joining. So I started collecting T206, and then I got invited to Tobacco Row in Facebook. And so I started to meet some really, really knowledgeable collectors and people who had some insane cards. But after a few months after the National, I knew that I wanted to know and collect these cards more. And so what I did though was I started buying all the cards. My first goal was to do the 520. I wanted to get them all. And I got to about 130 cards to the set. Now, this is probably late 2020, early 2021. But what was happening was I was buying cards online. They were coming into my house and I wasn't opening them. And I was like, what am I doing here? Like, I'm buying these cards, yet I have zero energy or excitement to open the package.
Isn't that amazing, Chris, the kind of problems we have as collectors?
Yeah, I know, exactly. But if you go back to some of my earlier YouTube videos, I always talked about, and this was sort of unintentional, but I talked about the fact that the polar bear was my favorite back. The dark blue back, it stands out amongst all the T206 backs. And when I did my research and learned about polar bear, it's 250 of the 520 card set for the everyday collector. You get a good sampling of Hall of Famers. Yes, they're two of the rarest cards in the set. That is an absolute atrocious purchase. It's out there. But for the most part, you get a really good taste of the set in polar bear alone.
How long did it take you to complete the run of polar bears?
If you go back to the very beginning, about 4.5 years. But
wow.
if you take a look at I would say the last 2 years. So I finished the set in the end of December of 2023. It was a good 2+ year pursuit of just buying polar bears. But the first 2 years were sort of haphazard, buying cards. And when I sold them all off, I ended up with about 30 polar bears. That was my dominant back brand when I sold them all off. So I kind of had a head start, but It was a good 2+ year journey to finish the 250.
And for the collectors out there, Chris, that maybe are also intimidated by the T206 set, but would like to start collecting it, can you share with the listeners maybe some of the places that you would buy the cards or trade for them along the way?
Yeah, so from a purchase perspective, you can never go wrong with eBay. I will tell you right now, eBay, though, is challenging for me as a collector now because so many people have up their listings without a best offer. And that's, for me personally speaking, mildly frustrating, if not highly irritating. But, REA, Heritage, the big websites, I think I've spent way too much money with both of those combined. But I'll tell you, they have fantastic customer service. Facebook groups are a big one. Twitter and Instagram is different. I, over the past year, have met more people on Instagram for T206, but I'll tell you, a majority of the collectors are in Facebook groups. I'm a member of 3 or 4 different Facebook groups for T206. And also, I'll tell you, Net54, it's a message board. It is, it's a little bit, for the modern day new kid collector, it's a little bit archaic because it's not social media, but there is so much knowledge on there. And so many people on there who know way more than I'll ever know about T206 or polar bear on there. I'm more of a reader on Net54 than I am a poster, but there is so much information on there.
Well, that's a great point, Chris, about Net54. I actually had Leon Lucky, the owner of Net54 message boards, on Trading Card Therapy a few episodes ago. So if you'd like to check that out, folks, you could do that on my Just Collect YouTube channel, or wherever you enjoy your favorite podcasts like Apple and Spotify. Leon has actually never done another podcast. So that one was well received. I have a question for you, Chris, to try to help other collectors out there, because eBay I know very well. The auction houses that you mentioned I know very well and agree with everything you said. I find, believe it or not, the Facebook groups and doing business on IG. So remember, doing business versus just coordinating and talking to people is different. So you were actually transacting and maybe buying or selling. How does someone who's a little bit intimidated by Facebook or IG, meaning the financial end of it, can you offer a tip or two how a collector can protect themselves? Because if you don't know who you're dealing with, how or why do you feel comfortable to maybe pay them first before they send you the card?
Yeah, so your number one, and this kind of goes back to why I always advocate buying raw. Number one, you are your best resource. You're your best judge of character. If the deal feels wrong, it's going to feel wrong, right? But once you get to know these cards and look at these cards, and I say do your research on these cards, you will know instantaneously if a card is real or not. And look, no one is faking a dummy Taylor, Sovereign 350, or Polar Bear, right? They're gonna make a fake Ty Cobb, right? They're gonna make a fake Walter Johnson. They're not faking. And for example, Polar Bear, 86% of the cards are common players. It's only that real upper echelon that could potentially be faked. But I'll tell you, you just have to research and do your own looking at these cards. But if the deal feels wrong, the deal feels wrong. I'll tell you, my last purchase for my set was a $2,000 raw Ty Cobb. That's not a purchase I'm making 4 years ago. But because of the fact that I got to know people and ask questions and also just look at all the cards, I was confident that also the guy had a reputation, a great reputation overall. But this wasn't just a random purchase, but the knowledge I obtained over the 4 years helped me understand that that's a good purchase. I'm not rolling the dice on a raw Ty Cobb.
No, so it's very well put. Chris, just for our collector friends that are out there, could you maybe shout out a Facebook group or two for T206 collecting that you would recommend?
Yeah, so if you could get into Tobacco Row, you've got to be recommended. That's a huge one. There's other T206 ones out there. I don't know the names off the top of my head right now, so I apologize on the exact names. But
we can always go back and put it in the comments later on when we put out the video.
Absolutely, 100%.
All right, so I've been holding off because I know for me, I'm certainly interested, and I think for those folks who might know you a little bit, they're interested and they don't know the story, but I know that everyone who's watching this is going to be interested. Before we ask the question, Chris, why don't you flash some of those very interesting tattoos you have on your arms, and we're going to start talking about it.
So the left arm is my tribute to my polar bear journey. So you'll see the polar bear back right there with the polar bear and everything. But every card has a meaning to my actual set. And then my right arm is a tribute to the cigarette brands from the set. And then I also wanted an Old Mill tribute. So on this arm, you have Dolly Stark, which is my favorite Southern Leaguer. But then the back, it's hard to see in the camera, but there's the Old Mill tobacco back right here. But this is meant to commemorate where the cards came from. And then the left arm, of course, is my journey to complete the polar bear set.
All right. So folks, if there was ever a reason to watch Trading Card Therapy on YouTube instead of listening to it on Apple or Spotify, Chris Torres is giving you a reason today, because you will not be able to see these tattoos on Apple or Spotify by listening to the episode. So Chris, those are incredible works of art. And I know that, some people feel very strongly about tattoos. Other people, feel the opposite. Putting all of that noise aside, I think it's amazing. But some people might think it's a little crazy. So could you share with us, how did this journey start? Because you're talking about the cards, but that is just the cards. Did you decide over a drunken night one night to go to the thanks for laughing, the tattoo parlor with a buddy, and you said, hey, if you get Evers, I'll get Chance?
Yeah. No, and for a quick reference, if you want to see more photos, you can go to my Instagram at CRT_sports cards. So you can see all the photos there. But this was, again, at least a 1 year journey. I, number one, had to find the right artist, because if I picked the wrong artist who cannot do portraits, I would never wear a short sleeve shirt again, because I'd be too embarrassed to show it off. So I was recommended this artist from a previous job of mine. And so I sent her what I wanted to do. Okay. And Stephanie on Instagram, she is at Nature Knox. It's NATURENOX. She's phenomenal. She's the one who really put all this together. And, I had ideas of my first idea was to do the 5 most important cards of the set. That was my idea. But she's like, that's too small. You have to do it bigger. And so she was the perfect person to sit there and put the flat objects on a round body and to make it look phenomenal. Frank Chance is on my forearm, in the perfect spot. The wrong artist puts it on my elbow and it looks awful. So
terrible. Sure.
She did a lot of the hard work. She did all the work. I just sat there for many, many hours. But originally, though, it was just me sending her an image of, here's what I want to do. Let's go down this road together. And it came out just absolutely wonderfully.
Oh, they're amazing. I'm curious, did you ever have any tattoos before the T206 tattoo journey?
None. So that's the interesting part is,
wow,
I always wanted a tattoo. But to your earlier point, I never wanted a random one. I never wanted one to look back and go, what the heck was I thinking doing this? And so I went through, most people at 40 years old, maybe buy a Corvette, right? A midlife crisis. At 40, I sat down and had my very first tattoo session. And now at 42, I have both of my arms covered with tobacco-related sports cards. So maybe you call it my midlife crisis.
Fair enough. I'll tell you this, Chris. I don't have a tattoo. I've considered getting one.
Yeah.
I know this to be a definitive fact. I'm so impressed by your tattoos that if I ever cross that bridge and get one, I don't know that I'll get a T206 one, that's for sure. But I would absolutely reach out to you and ask for your advice because it's phenomenal.
I appreciate
it. And I think that one of the first times I met you was at a convention. I'm like, oh my God, what's going on there? And you told me about it. And we've kept in touch ever since. It's really incredible.
Yeah, it's really a journey. On the left arm, the polar bear really it commemorates the journey to complete the set. And I think that's what I wanted originally was, every card has has my first polar bear, the last polar bear, seeing Del Howard, he's on my arm, my first ever two T206, Solly Hoffman and Harry Hinchman, which thankfully are in polar bear. So they do fit the theme, even though they're not in the polar bear set, they're kind of minor. But yeah, the left arm is truly like for me, a way to look back and commemorate. So even if I sell my set in 20 or 30 years, who knows, or maybe never sell it, I'll always have the memory of how I built the set over those many years.
That's amazing, Chris. And I know you said just a little bit ago in the episode that, and I followed you on Instagram, or I follow you on Instagram, so I know this to be true. You're really fascinated with the stories behind the players. And I was curious for today's episode, could you maybe share just one of the players and their stories from the T206 set that is really interesting and that you find meaning with for our audience? Yeah,
so there are a lot of great stories, don't get me wrong, but one that always sticks out to me, and I mentioned his name earlier, is Dummy Taylor. You see that name in that card, and you don't think about it again. You just Dummy Taylor, great, in the set. But as I was doing my research on him for a reel I put out, he was called Dummy because he was deaf and mute. And this blows your mind as a modern day watcher of baseball. Like, is a deaf and mute person ever going to play baseball in these days? No. But he also then was able to, through his hard work after his career, he did mentor another deaf and mute player, but I can't remember his name right now. But he was able to escape that moniker when he made it to the major leagues. And so Dummy Taylor was able to basically be called Dummy as a player. But then when he saw the kid he mentored make the major leagues, that nickname had not been used again. So he's one that you just look at a card and go, okay, Dummy, but there's a deeper meaning and a deeper process to that name overall.
Really interesting, Chris. I have a buddy of mine, shout out to Joe Ferguson, who follows the show, and he's a big Dummy Taylor fan. And I had known all about him, largely because of him. Mm-hmm. And as you just mentioned, it's just one of countless other amazing stories in the set. And if I had to say for my own collecting journey with my son, it's probably something I'm going to focus on in the future, because I thought about as I sit here with you, my son has an Aaron Judge shirt on today, and he's not necessarily a big Yankee fan, but he likes the Yankees because his daddy likes the Yankees. We've gone to a few games together, and it has some meaning to him. But yet we've never talked about, where does Aaron Judge come from? Where did he grow up? What's an interesting fact about him? Yeah. As I sit here with you, Chris, it really might be kind of like that next level of collecting, whether it be you're young or old, to get people interested in our space. Because man, some of these stories are like made for TV movies, like, ready to be made. Yeah.
And I'll give you another one here. And this goes back to a knowledge perspective of learning T206. So there's a podcast series called the Monster Podcast. And it's 5 years old now, 6 years old. You'll kind of laugh at the figures they're talking about how cheap the cards were 5 years ago, but there's so much information in there. But that's where I was introduced to Dolly Stark. And so Dolly Stark on my arm was killed December 1st, 1924. So 100 years ago now, but at just 39 years old. And he was killed in a bar fight in Memphis, Tennessee. And he was killed by his own weapon, and his wife was present when he was killed. And so that was my introduction into Monroe Dolly Stark. And so I just love that story. And they didn't go into the details of the story, but learning how young he was when he passed away, that was my first ever Southern League purchase, just because of that podcast. For whatever reason, that name stuck with me in that story. And that's where I ended up with Dolly Stark.
Who runs the Monster Podcast? Is that Jay or am I
it's
thinking
Jay? Yeah, Jay and Justin Goodman. I think it's Jay and Justin.
Yeah, I'm going to try to get them on a future episode of Trading Card Therapy. I think it'll be a fantastic episode.
Oh, that series altogether, I've listened to it probably each episode 6-7 times, years after I first listened to it. It's phenomenal.
That's really cool. Well, I appreciate you shouting them out. So I'm curious, you've now shifted, you've completed the Polar Bear back set, and you've now gone full throttle. You're trying to complete the whole set.
Correct. Yes.
Why don't you tell the audience where you're at on your journey? How many do you have out of the 5 and change?
Yeah. So publicly speaking, I have 280 of 520. Okay. Now I'm doing it again in a very unique way. I know one of my mistakes when I first did this was buying all random backs and having an ugly kind of set, in my opinion. And that was one of my rules when I first started doing Polar Bear was I want clean back cards. You'll hear people, a lot of people talk at times. I don't care about the back. All I care about is the back. That's all that I cared about. You can have paper loss on the front. That's fine. Is the blue basically all there in a Polar Bear? That was my one rule for the set. But I didn't. So to complete this 520, I wanted to do it in a unique way so that when it is complete, it may be even potentially more valuable. So I'm doing a complete Sovereign 150 set. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, the Sovereign 150 back are the original 150 subjects in the set. I'm also doing the 48 Old Mill Southern Leaguers. And then recently, and I thought this was neat, just from this kind of happened haphazardly, was I had another 72 cards of what am I going to do? How am I going to finish the set? Because there really isn't another 72 card background set in there. And so I started figuring out, realizing, okay, I can do Piedmont 350s and then also mix in a couple Elite 11s from the Sovereign 150. So I've got 2 Elite 11s right now of the Piedmont 350. So when my set is complete in the next 4.5 years, it's going to be simply 4 backs: Polar Bear, Sovereign 150, Piedmont 350, and then Old Mill Southern League.
That's awesome. So you said you think it's going to take another several years. Do you have a plan for the set when you're done? In other words, you're going to put it in the safety deposit box, or you're going to sell it and start another journey, or you're going to take some time off from the hobby, or anything in between?
I have no idea. It's hard to say. I would like to have this set done by 2030. You know, if I get 1 card a week for the next 4.5 years, right, the set's complete. But, you know, luck could change or luck could not. It's hard to say. But right now, also, I could get to 350 and go, I really only truly love Polar Bears. So let me sell off. You know, I'm not a person where I'll say I'm not wrong here and say, why am I doing this? Because, you know, I was with Polar Bear, I was kind of getting bored a little bit because all I was doing is upgrading. And so then it kind of got me going down 520. So maybe in another year or so, I'll be like, oh, this is dumb. I only want Polar Bear, and I'll sell the rest of them off. So who knows?
No, listen, I appreciate your honesty. And I think, candidly, Chris, that's what makes collecting so fun and unique to all of us individually, is that there really isn't a right or wrong way. You know, if you want to create value, maybe there is a steadfast way to create value. But for a lot of us out there, when we collect, we're doing it as a distraction from what's going on in our regular everyday lives. So we're not necessarily focused on, the monetary return. And in this case, it sounds like that's, the scoop for you. You, of course, want your cards to go up. You want to put something together that's, maybe more substantial than the parts. But at the same time, you don't seem overly concerned. And I think that that's great.
Yeah, I have no indication or no inkling right now to sell anything at the moment. So maybe I'll keep it my whole life. Maybe, Vintage Breaks 2060 or 2080 will be selling my collection in the future. Who knows? I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you never know.
Yeah.
So switch gears for a minute, Chris. There's been a lot of amazing collectors, and a lot of them from yesteryear collected the T206s. I feel like you know the hobby history pretty well from some of what we talked about in terms of 06s. Is there one collector, either alive or, to be fair, deceased, that you would really like to meet and have a conversation with?
It's when you look at anyone who collects pre-war back in the day, it's the godfather of collecting, Jefferson Burdick. Like, the question is why? Why would you do this? Like, what? No one had done it before. Right? What was the motivation? And I think I would leave it at that and just let him talk.
Honestly, that's exactly what I would do, Chris. And I got to imagine that in the response, there would just be an incredible amount of love and passion for collecting. And, listen, some people, I guess they collect dolls and, old Twinkies, right? I mean, literally anything and everything in between. But I agree that it would be great to hear from the source himself. Unfortunately, we will never know, but at least we have, the guides and his guidance that he's left us the many decades later. So, Chris, not that this is, I know you're a collector, so meaning a dealer might answer this different, an investor might answer this different, but I'll try to keep it simple. Share with the audience one thing that in today's hobby you absolutely love and something in today's hobby that you don't like and that you'd like to see change.
Sure. The one thing I love the most is the people. I have met so many great individuals in this hobby, right? The people make the hobby. And for me, that's what I love the most about it. The one thing that I would say I don't like about the modern day hobby, and this is what scares me when I think about long-term in 20, 30 years, is if you come in new to the hobby today, I feel that you're being introduced to the hobby as a pure gamble. And I don't think the hobby is a gamble. The hobby is at its core a collecting space for people. But I'm fearful that if people come in, drop $3,000 on group breaking and end up with a $50 autograph, they're going to leave with a huge credit card bill and just getting burned. And they're never going to realize and understand how cool collecting is. And so that's where I'm fearful for the future of how many we're going to lose because their first introduction into the hobby is it's a pure gamble like a sports bet.
Listen, it's a great question. And candidly, I certainly have no answer. But, as someone who runs a breaking company and also runs, a company that buys, sells, and appraises vintage cards, meaning just collect, I certainly hear you loud and clear. And candidly, Chris, it's one of the reasons why the name of my company and most of the products we deal with are vintage. Now, we do handle some modern products, but certainly not at the volume that some of the other big breakers do. And in particular, Chris, not to make this a whole sales pitch for vintage breaks, but I was the one who kind of came up with set breaks and rolling them out years ago. I really like the whole idea of buying like a spot in a 62 top set break for $12 or $15. You might lose, you might get a common, but you still have a piece of history. Yes. And you still have a chance to get a Mickey Mantle or Lou Brock rookie or whatever the case is. I think that all your questions in regards to like what's going to happen with the future are relevant. I would say that my son, who just turned 10, he collects one piece. So it's not the same as, of course, the sports cards that you and I collect. And I'm not suggesting that it's the manufacturer's fault, because to be clear, in the 90s when I was collecting Fleer Ultra basketball, I knew on the back the odds for like, all team defensive, whatever the case was, an Upper Deck or Fleer Ultra. And yet it still felt like I was collecting. So something that I try to do with my son is even the cards that he thinks are not good or good enough, like we don't throw them out. I'll ask him, hey, like, why are these cards not so good? And in fact, what it's doing is it might cause us to start playing. There's actually a one-piece game. And I know that there's not a game in all of the sports cards, but you bring up a really great point, Chris. And I think that one of the ways to help people is through education. And so to be clear, I think breaking is wonderful if you are collecting the Yankees with your son and you can't buy a $983 hobby box and you're going to get into a break for $1.25. You may not get the Yankees you want, but at least you can sit there, right? Hey, Cross, we're hoping for an Aaron Judge or whatever the case is. So that's what I mean by education. And to be clear, just like if you go to the real casino, there's plenty of people that should not be in the real casino, Chris.
Absolutely.
Even though they're legally allowed. So I think it's the same in our space. I believe that if the manufacturers, if the platforms like Fanatics and whatnot, and then of course the individual breakers like ourselves included, can educate people, they at least have a fighting chance to make a more solid decision and stand on that decision moving forward, Chris.
Correct.
But who knows what the future is going to hold? We don't know.
Yeah, and I do want to, and this is not meant to be as a advertisement for your company, Vintage Breaks, but I really, as a person in the hobby, differentiate a set break versus someone selling 30 spots for a 5-card box. Like you've
Sure.
already got 24 losers right there automatically. And I'm supposed to be happy with that. Yet I think that when you, like, I think I did with you all years ago, a 53 top set break.
Sure.
And I knew
that.
I was going to get a card back. I think that's different because you're going to get something versus 95% of people going home empty-handed. That's what I don't like. And I think that's the difference of the two.
Listen, I agree with you wholeheartedly. When I was at my buddy's house yesterday, some of his kids participate in breaks, and he does not do the breaks where you don't get all the cards that you win or that you get.
Correct.
He just doesn't understand. And even though he knows they're not worth a lot, he's like, but they're mine. They're my son's cards. And so I agree, Chris. I think that it could still, certainly use a lot of guidance, but also education, I think, is paramount. Mm-hmm. And it's not really being offered right now.
Correct.
So what I wanted to do is ask you a quick question I forgot to ask earlier. I was shocked. I did not know you were a D1 golfer. Did you ever collect golf cards?
Never. So, what did I think about? I owned a John Daly autograph when I first started collecting. I think Pro Set or something like that. But yeah, I never collected golf cards.
Okay. I'm looking for these days a nice Bobby Jones autograph and a Bobby Jones photo. And I'm not an avid golfer. I certainly like tennis a lot more. But I like historical figures in sports that have been around for a long time. That's kind of how I took to that. So the last thing that I was going to leave you with, and then, of course, I want to remind everyone how they can find you on socials, Chris, is so I've been talking about this for like the last week or so. I really think it's a great time of year, especially when we all as collectors have a little bit of time off, to go into our collections and kind of prune them, and figure out, what, I have 3 of this. I'm not going to work on that set anymore. So I'm either going to sell off or I'm going to trade. So, Chris, what I'm going to offer you is, and I don't know if you actually have doubles or not, but you can check out my eBay store, just_collect. I have about 75 T206s in the store. I don't know if you need any of them for your set, but if you do, I'd be happy to offer you some sort of trade. And this is what I want to throw out to the other collectors listening to this as well. Do yourself a favor and take the $5, the $10, the $20 cards. And if you need a $500 card from me, trade up. A lot of dealers won't do that. But because we're in this unique position where I can do other things with the cards, I would love to help you and some other collectors by the end of the year, because I want to hit the ground running next year. But by the end of the year, I'd like to try to execute some trades to help you turn some of your doubles, your triplicates, your unwanted set, cards that you're no longer working on into maybe an extra card or 2 for your 06 set. So instead of it taking 4.5 years, Chris, it'll take you 4.25.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Absolutely.
Yeah, no problem. But Chris, this is not just for you, but this is for other collectors that are listening to this that may want to reach out. If you want to reach me, you can do so via email at Leighton, Leighton at justcollect.com. And Chris, of course, you know how to find me if you'd like to work out a trade. I'd love to help you out. Mm-hmm. But Chris, if someone wants to do a deal with you and share with you some of the T206s that you might need for your set or trade with you, what's the best way that they can reach you?
So the best way to get a hold of me is on Instagram is at CRT_sports cards. I'm also on X at the same name, but I use Instagram more often. You can find me on YouTube and everywhere else, but mainly Instagram is the best format for communication. But if you don't have either one of those, you can email me at chris@crtsportscards.com. That's the way to email me if you're not on social media.
Very cool. Well, Chris, I am so appreciative and grateful for you joining us today here on Trading Card Therapy. I hope I can help you just a little bit on your journey to complete your T206 set. And I hope that you and your family have a fantastic holiday season.
You too. Thank you so much, Leighton. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Chris. Take care. Be well.
Take care.
All right, folks. That is our guest for today, Chris Torres of CRT Sports Cards. You can find him on IG and YouTube. Just a tremendous wealth of knowledge, not only for the T206 set, but in general for the hobby. He's a great steward, certainly a lot of fun to talk to. And if you ever see him in person at the show, definitely get a pic with him in the tattooed arms, because I have it in my collection, and I think it's great. Until next time, folks, I'm your host, Leighton Sheldon, the Doctor, signing off. This is Trading Card Therapy, episode number 84. We'll see you soon. Happy holidays.